Good afternoon, everyone. From pandemic preparedness over to sustainable plastics, a stretch that maybe doesn't seem so impossible when you start to think about the amount of plastics that we used during the pandemic and how our own interest in environmental protection has heightened as a result of the pandemic. So I'm pleased to introduce today a great panel that really represents the plastics supply chain. I'd like to introduce Haley Lowry with Dow, representing a raw materials supplier, Stephanie Potter with Nestle, that represents a brand owner who's in charge of packaging design, and Brent Bell with Waste Management, who really looks at how do we manage plastics at the end of their life. So what we want to do today is really talk about the intersections of sustainable plastics, innovation, and investment. Where are we? Where are we headed? And what are the opportunities here in the US to really advance this as a competitive advantage? So I'm going to open up with a question for each one of my panelists. Haley, I'm going to start with you, which is, what would you define as sustainable plastics? And what is a collaboration that you guys are doing or an initiative that you guys are doing that you think really reflects that?
Yeah, thank you so much. So for my side, I think, a sustainable plastic is one that is truly circular as well as has a very low carbon footprint. So at Dow, we aim to be the leading circular solutions provider at the lowest CO2 footprint. And one of the initiatives that I am most proud of is in progression of our advanced recycling efforts. Today, the recycling system needs significant investment and innovation to be able to match supply of waste in these materials with the demands that our companies and over 400 brands have set commitments to have their products to be more recyclable, made with recycled content, and be reusable. And so at Dow, we see a significant opportunity to make new plastics from waste plastics, plastics that are truly circular. And today there's a large percentage of plastics that are not mechanically recycled through the recycling system today. And that's where technologies like advanced recycling come into play. One of the things that we talked about today in our 2021 Investor Day, we had an Investor Day that was solely focused on ESG at the New York Stock Exchange early in October. And I mentioned that we would be launching a circular plastic next year through our partnerships and our innovation that we've built. And so plastics do have one of the lowest greenhouse gas emissions compared to other material types already, but we have our eye on the future, and we're working on developing even lower carbon footprint products. And we announced a new investment in the world's first zero carbon emissions plant in Canada. So for us, that's a vision that we can see. It's a vision that products can save emissions when they're being used, and when they reach the end of their useful life of the product being over, you can get those back and really keep that cycle going. So with investment, policy support, innovation, infrastructure, and desire, this is not just a pipe dream. It's really in front of us now.
Thank you, Haley. Stephanie, what's your thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I would say, from the design side, it's around designing for the system that you're moving the plastics into. From the perspective of Nestle being in 97% of U.S. households and being one of the largest food and beverage companies in the world, for us, plastics is, when we think of plastics, we think about it with respect to packaging, and everything that we do needs to come in a package, and that is inclusive of plastics and other materials as well. So for us, fit for purpose in terms of using as little as you can, but as making sure that it's preserving the integrity of the product it's intended to protect, and that has its own sustainability kind of attached to it with respect to food waste mitigation and the rest. But for us, we have pretty ambitious goals attached to our packaging portfolio and attached to plastics in particular around reducing our use of virgin plastic by 1/3 in the next 3 years, making sure that all of our plastics packaging is recyclable, using increasing amounts of recycled content. So with all of these goals, we really need to be thinking about how to not only be designing for the future that kind of our consumers are heading into with consumption patterns and the rest, but also making sure that the downstream side is equipped to handle that packaging and taking full responsibility for the life cycle of the packaging and the plastics that we're putting into the market. So to your second part of your question about kind of one, product or something that we're working on. I would say from the recyclability standpoint, we're really thinking about, aiming toward aiming toward industry recognized standards for circular design, and making sure that that's embedded across the brands and the plastics formats and packaging formats that we're utilizing. One example would be our Starbucks creamers. So fun fact, Starbucks is there are portions that are part of the Nestle business, and we in 2018 put out a creamer bottle that had recyclability from the perspective of the primary bottle, the kind of core piece, and then also a recycling compatible ink on the shrink film, thinking about the cap and the recyclability of that. So it's not just one piece, but it's thinking about the whole of the product and the plastics components attached to it. Another one would be from a recycled content standpoint. Purina is another brand of Nestle. Hopefully this is also a way of introducing the breadth of the brands that we have and the companies that we have in the US. But Purina has a Tidy Cats jug that uses 50% recycled content, and that alone has saved kind of 200,000 pounds of virgin plastic just in terms of the amount that we're putting into market. So we're really trying to capture not just the innovations that we're kind of designing around, but also the footprint implications of those innovations. And that's all, things that we're kind of publicly starting to talk about and really share for the good of the whole system. So I'll stop there, but there's plenty of other examples that I'm happy to talk about.
Some exciting innovations. Thank you, Stephanie. Brent, let's hear from your perspective as a waste management company. How does sustainable plastics fit into your vision?
Yeah, so thanks for having us here. On waste management's viewpoint, we're somewhat the material gatekeeper for a lot of these materials, and plastics has been the forefront of the conversations lately. While it's less than 5% of the recycling stream that we see in the average curbside container, it's north of 30 to 40% of the value of that material. And so one thing we've seen, and Nestle, Stephanie is right at the forefront of this. The brand's commitment to using recycled content helps drive that value for those recycled materials. So part of waste management's goal has been the last few years, how do we unlock more of this supply of this valuable plastic materials that's potentially going into the landfills, and how do we redirect that into the right bin in the recycling system? Some of it's education programs, but also it's access to recycling, making sure that we get larger bins out there at the curbside, making sure that we're in communities that don't have access today to give them more recycling access, so that we can get more of this valuable material back into the right bin, into the recycling stream. The rough estimates on our side, if you look at the demand that's out there with some of these commitments that brands have made, it's 3 to 5 times the amount of supply we have today. So from our position, we have to absolutely do our job on the collection side and the processing side to make sure we can capture this material and get it back into the brands who are using this for recycled content.
Excellent. Interesting that demand far exceeds supply. I don't know how much we talk about that publicly. So thanks for bringing that out. All of you guys, at least representatives from your company, have been involved in some roundtables discussions that the Chamber Foundation has had looking at this intersection. And one of the things that came out of that struck me, and I'd love to hear from Haley and Brent on this one, is that innovators can come up with ideas, they can prove the validity of their technology, but to get it to scale seems to be a real challenge in terms of getting the investment that they need. Can you guys talk a little bit about what you guys are doing with innovators, or what role you're playing in terms of trying to address your own innovation challenges? Let's start with Brent.
Sure. So, every year we do have a kind of an innovations forum where we invite folks to come and participate. And we do often do quite a few investments in, what the next big idea could be for some of these, some of these ideas and concepts. So we have a special group that does those investments, and we track it. And most of the time we're a, minority, shareholder of that company and try to help them progress. But then we have some more, further advanced, well-funded innovations like robotics, where we work with robotics companies to install those systems into our facilities. Understanding they're not going to work great day one. It's just, kind of like your first cell phone. It's not going to have all the features that your cell phone today has. But we have to work with those innovations in our plants to let them have that kind of access, so that we can get to the point where we need to be. And robotics is just a great example, but access to our facilities and making sure we can kind of help further their development.
So sometimes it's access. It's not just always investment then.
right?
Yeah, that's interesting here. Haley, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so we have seen a really big shift in movement in ESG funding, and I would say that is starting to totally tip the scale on investment available for many of these new innovations. At Dow, we launched our sustainability targets to stop the waste, close the loop, and protect the climate in June in 2020, and we've seen progression on each of these. And 5 years ago, we started something called the Dow Impact from our Dow Foundation. Over that time period, we allocated $5 million across 25 projects that address circularity and waste. And to get funding for many of these grants, you had to have a measurable social, environmental, and a business impact. And so that's where many of these projects got started. And that's where they were birthed out of. But as the pilots continued to progress, you know, this is one of the big areas. As a Fortune 100 company, we need scale. And many of these startups are brilliant at speed and acceleration, but you know, Dow and larger companies have the scale. So you have to find ways to bridge that gap. But after many of these impact fund pilots, we've seen opportunities to progress in terms of funding of equity or loans or venture capital arms of the corporation, as well as many other VC impact funding through ESG. That space is really starting to increase. So I would say the investment should not be the problem in the future. Getting to that scale, there's plenty of investment available, and it will be even more available as ESG continues to progress.
Haley,
Okay.
can I take a crack at it too, or are we off to?
Yeah, go for
All right.
it.
Just to sort of carry out further the upstream downstream side, I think for us, one of the upstream kind of investments that we're making is actually kind of a first in the food industry. It's an R&D center out of Switzerland called the Nestle Institute for Packaging Sciences, and it's kind of our way of in-house testing refillable and reuse, you know, kind of models, simplified packaging, plastics packaging formats, alternatives to plastic, bio-based, et cetera, and then putting those into markets pretty intentionally in terms of where we can kind of road test some of it and then tweak and carry back on. So that's one on the sort of design side that I think is pretty interesting and not as well known that Nestle has been investing in for the past 2 years or so. And then on the kind of collection side, we stood up 2 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago. We have a private equity fund within the Closed Loop Partners Group, and that's called the Closed Loop Leadership Fund. And that is all about trying to shore up the infrastructure and help kind of modernize and, you know, flow funds through to promote some of that modernization and that optimization that needs to happen. So we have a portfolio of companies that have been seeded through that fund, and we'll continue to look at opportunities to do that. But really the idea there is to the supply and demand comments that Brent was making, figuring out ways to increase the flow of, you know, feedstock that we can then reuse in packaging going forward. So those are two in terms of just kind of putting funds into the market and trying to make them work for the sustainability goals that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. No, that's interesting. You guys have all mentioned in each one of your examples, kind of going after a bigger picture and collaborating with other people in order to get after that. That was one of the pieces of feedback that we had within the roundtables, was this need for breaking down silos so that, you know, it's not plastics packaging, it's maybe plastics in general, and how can textiles and automotives and packaging all work together, as well as, you know, how do we even think bigger and broader? You know, is there a role for, say, zoos and you know, restaurants that are you know, serving fast food cups and utensils and things like that would have single-use plastics? Is there a way for us to all collaborate? And so I'm wondering if you guys can give examples that you haven't already shared about where those collaborations are really happening to break down those silos and go for that bigger picture. Let's start with Stephanie.
Sure. I think there's a couple of cuts. One would be maybe intra-industry, right? Where kind of competitors in the marketplace for Nestle, we are kind of starting to realize that some of these goals that we've stood up pertaining to sustainable plastics are really not sort of one company's problem to solve, and actually one company probably can't solve it no matter how much you're putting into the design side or the investment side or whatnot. So we actually have stood up what we call the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance, and it's comprised of Nestle, Danone, Mars, and Unilever. And what's unique about it, I think, is that it's very much sort of self-run, right? So we're working on kind of the priorities, and we're working on how to move those through and how to execute these, and what other partners we need to pull in to get that done. But we have kind of shared issues when it comes to solving some of the things that our employees and consumers and supply chain and customers need. And so we're looking at aligning around specific climate principles, recycling and infrastructure principles, and plastic waste reduction kind of principles to make sure that we're unified in how we are going about solving these challenges, and that we're doing so kind of in a larger, hopefully a larger voice. So that's, I think, one that's kind of an interesting, competitor recognition that some of these things are pre-competitive and need to be solved together. So that's a really fun group to be a part of. The one that I think, the second one, which is more cross-industry and public-private, would be, I think that the U.S. Plastics Pact, which just started a little while ago, is starting to really get some legs under it in terms of, it's one of many pacts all over the world, so that helps kind of beating the drum in various markets and customizing the solutions toward the market that the pact is operating in. But I think for the U.S., which is the one I sit in, it's good because it's helping us align around some industry accepted standards for on the design side and on the sort of standard side, and just making sure that we're kind of rowing in the same direction and bringing increasing numbers of players who have some input into whichever side of the plastics conversation under the same tent to be talking together. The other thing I think that's helpful about it is on the brand side and on the industry side, it's helping us figure out what we're aiming toward in terms of really aggregating some of that data about the plastics we're putting into the market, so that we know what the size of the pie is that we need to be addressing. So I'm interested in continuing to be part of that conversation and see where that goes in the next couple of years, as there are sort of specific 2025 targets attached to some of that work.
Certainly compelling reason, yeah, for competitors to kind of collaborate. Brent, do you have any examples that you guys wanted to share from waste management perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, it's kind of the whole circularity starts at what gets put on the shelves, from packaging design. Are these packages easy to recycle for a consumer in their curbside program, right? That's usually the first step. And then how can we play a part in that, and making sure our technology can keep up with it and can process, separate to the highest value. But all the collaboration starts with what comes in, what comes on the shelves, and making sure that it's the education programs for consumers. It seems like plastics is at the top of the list for the most confusing item. They all have numbers on the bottom, right? And there's these rotating arrows on everything, but yet some stuff goes in the bin, some stuff can't go in the bin. So just making that a simple education message, and then also making the packages on the shelves easy to recycle.
I'm going to change focus a little bit, just looking at where we are in terms of time. I'm going to start with Brent in terms of infrastructure. There's a lot of discussion right now about our recycling systems being behind the times, but we're also hearing from innovators that, investment to scale investments on, like, it's easier to get investment for software or, quick, easy, fast return investments as opposed to heavy infrastructure like building a new plant or a new facility. And so just wondering if you've got any thoughts around, funding for infrastructure here in the US. What do we need to do? What's missing?
Yeah, so earlier this week, we did make a public announcement for America Recycles Day on, we've invested $700 million by the end of 2022 over the last 2 years on, new recycling infrastructure. That includes, automating most of our facilities, to expanding capacity, and even entering some new markets that may not have full recycling access today. So all that investment is geared towards unlocking more of the supply of material, how we can get it out of the landfill into the proper recycling containers. That's includes multifamily, commercial, and then our existing customer base as well. But we definitely look at the EPA's goal of 50% recycled diversion by 2030. And we see the demand that, customers are having and the brands are making commitments on. And this ESG movement is as Haley, has mentioned, it's here to stay, right? Whether that's in executive compensation, this has changed over the last decade where people are taking this seriously, and we're seeing that. And so we absolutely want to make sure we can provide the infrastructure and put that in place to handle this. And so, we're doing our part, but there's still a long way to go.
Thanks, Brent. Haley, any thoughts from you guys?
Yeah, this is an incredibly important area. We did some work with the Recycling Partnership, and they actually outlined a report that showed it would take about $17 billion of investment over the next 5 years to totally transform the residential recycling system. So all of the investments that Brent just talked about is a really great first start. And I think we have to continue to make the system accessible to all, ambiguous, so that everyone can recycle across the entire US, and that will help us match the supply and demand. One of the examples that we've invested in has been the Closed Loop Circular Plastics Fund in North America that we recently helped launch, and that is to put investments into scalable recycling technologies, equipment upgrades, and infrastructure solutions. That's initially a $25 million investment, but we're working to grow that catalytically to over 100 million. And so these types of initiatives and investments are going to continue to be really critical, as well as, I may mention policy that we feel like is going to be absolutely required to totally get the system to where supply and demand match. And those are policy systems like EPR, where it really helps funnel the investments gained from or the money gained from the EPR system back into fix the infrastructure investments that need to happen. So I believe that there's a lot of opportunity here, and I'm very pro recycling and feel like we have a good pathway to fix the gaps of matching the supply and demand.
Thank you, Haley. Stephanie, what's Nestle's thoughts?
Yeah, just to further carry the point that Haley's making. One, I think we both mentioned kind of closed loop and some of our various investments around plastics and infrastructure. I actually see that as a really good thing. I don't see that as sort of, I think it's really helpful to direct funds to being able to sort of address some of this in different ways depending on the input. So I really like that we're starting to see some real kind of expertise come out of the US in terms of where funding should flow and how we should be thinking about private sector dollars. So that's just a quick comment on having kind of two different streams going with closed loop between the two of us, which is great. And then on the producer response, on the EPR side, which Haley mentioned, so Nestle globally is very, very supportive of these, what we call extended producer responsibility programs. We participate in them for consumer packaging all over the world. But basically what it is it's saying that, you're attaching a fee for packaging that's being put out into the market. And that fee can be, ideally, right, if designed in a certain way, it can be changed or it can be lowered if you have kind of better environmental performance and if certain kind of recycling targets are met. So what it does is it allows, it both brings the responsibility for that full life cycle management of plastics and packaging to the brand owners that are putting it into the market, but it's also incentivizing design for better performance by impacting kind of how much you're paying based on how your plastics moves or how your packaging moves. It's not specifically to plastics per se, but it's a really, I think, good legislative lever to be able to sort of drive some of those dollars to where it's most needed on the infrastructure side and on the education side too, to help consumers understand how to recycle in a way that keeps contamination out so that it allows for, better kind of recovery of some of that feedstock. So that's one that, we, among others on the industry side, are really, really supportive of. We've just seen it pass in 2 states for the first time in the US this year. And so I think we expect there to be a lot of energy around it next year. But the good news is that we've got a lot of experience on this from the 40 or so other countries that have already had this type of program in place. So I think that's the real opportunity when it comes to an infusion of capital into infrastructure in the coming couple of years, is that. So.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to close off with one question for you guys, which is, what can our audience do to really help advance the concept of sustainable plastics? Is there something we can do as individuals, or is it really all up to the corporations to solve? Let's start with Haley.
No, I think we all have a role to play in this. And I guess I have two thoughts. Is one, take some extra steps to help plastic that isn't currently curbside collected today, but it can be put into store drop-off locations. Take some of those extra steps. I know it's not super convenient for households, and it requires a little extra work to get this material back to the retailer, but we're trying to work on developing better systems as an entire industry. So let's not ignore what's working today. And just to give you an example, recently we partnered with Meyer, who's a retailer in the Midwest, to take their store drop-off material that they collected through their in-store recycling program back into technology that would pave their parking lots. And this recycled polymer modified asphalt parking lots was utilizing Dow's Elvaloy technology, and it used 12,000 pounds of post-consumer recycled material, which was equivalent to 944,000 plastic bags. So even just participating in some of those programs that are available that helps keep some of the contamination out of the bins today that cannot be recycled today in your curbside collection, but it can be in the store drop-off program. So like dry cleaning bags and films and bread bags, and some work that we've done with Kellogg with their bare naked granola pouches, things that have hard to recycle label on it. That is actually really valuable material, and it can be used for many applications like roads today, or maybe in the future, more packaging applications. So you can participate. And then the last thing that I would say is, you also have the power to drive purchasing decisions with the way that you buy your products. So buy products that are recyclable, buy products that are made with recycled content or have lower carbon solutions. A few of these things that we've been working on are recyclable toothpaste tubes, bio-based Crocs that are made from a bio-based renewable plastic. So every day, products are evolving to become more sustainable forms of those materials, so you can vote with your wallet.
Thank you, Haley. Important message right there. Brent, do you have any thoughts from a waste management perspective?
Yeah, I mean, Haley's exactly right. We always say there's two steps to recycling. There's putting the right items in your recycling bin, and then there's supporting and buying products that are made from recycled content or packages that use recycled content. That's just as important, the demand side of this. And so, we absolutely agree with her on, you can use that as your purchasing power, make sure your brands know that that's important to you. They're using recycled content in their packaging. And it goes all the way up to, corporations. We use all of our carts now are made from, recycled plastics, a percentage of that. Our frontline uniforms are made from recycled content. And then, as we talk to the federal government and other customers, buy materials that are made out of recycled content. That helps out with this whole circularity. And so the demand side is very important.
Excellent. Thank you. Stephanie, as the consumer-facing business here, what's your advice for consumers?
I think consumers are the most important. Speaking on behalf of Nestle, that is true north for us as a consumer packaged goods company. I will just say, to Haley's point, vote yes, of course, support by making that kind of purchasing decision, but also support by not giving up on the system. I think maybe that's a nod to Brent's lane a little bit is, don't lose faith in our ability to solve these challenges that we've all seen more visibly coming out of COVID. And I know that's been probably previous conversations had out of the Chamber Foundation, as has been a big deal, is just the more visible kind of, consumption habits that we have and what that looks like and where it goes. But really kind of continuing to be, intentional with kind of learning how to recycle, learning where things are, how to put things in the bin in a way that doesn't gum up the system, not wish cycling, all these things. I think that's, and we're part of that. We're part of that with our consumers, is really helping to do that education and making it easy. But not to give up is one thing I'd say. And yes, of course, continue to support those companies that are really trying to put more sustainable plastics into the market. That would be great. And then I think going kind of back upstream a little bit, I would say we've really enjoyed a lot of the collaborations that we've had with our retail partners who are really asking for this from their suppliers. I think there's a real platform for retailers, especially those that have a large footprint and a big voice, to be really partnering with the brands that they have on their shelves to try to get at this together. Same with, hotels and restaurants and other groups too. I mean, I think there's a real opportunity to partner on some of these sustainability goals that increasingly more and more of us have, not just the brands, but others across the industry. And then I guess finally, I'd say on the brand owner, the producer side, really kind of trying to all row in the same direction with respect to incorporating some of these circular design principles and put more of that into the market and be really clear and communicative that that's happening, so that we start to really kind of beat the drum for the importance of it. And it doesn't feel so much like one of us is on an island, but we're really all kind of just designing for the system that we want to have and designing for the future that we want to be in. So that's what I'd say.
Awesome. And on that note, I want to thank all of you guys. I think it was rather inspiring to hear the stories of collaboration and how you guys are all working together to try and advance the idea of sustainable plastics and the value of plastics. So thank you very much to Brent, to Haley, to Stephanie, and enjoy your afternoon, everyone.